The tremor in his hands made counting change impossible. The McDonald's line grew longer as the elderly man struggled with his wallet, customers behind him sighing with impatience. Nobody understood that the shaking wasn't from age, it was from Agent Orange exposure in Vietnamese jungles decades ago. Nobody understood, that is, until one teenager looked closer and saw the bracelet that explained everything. Robert Bobby Chen, 73 years old, stood at the McDonald's counter on Route 9, his weathered hands trembling as he tried to extract crumpled bills from his worn leather wallet. The wallet itself told a story. Faded brown leather with deep creases, a small hole where a piece of shrapnel had torn through it during the Battle of Firebase Charlie in 1969, though nobody here would ever know that detail. Inside, alongside the worn bills, were photos that had faded to sepia tones. His old squad, his parents who died while he was overseas, and one picture of a young soldier with an infectious smile. Jimmy Rodriguez. The restaurant was packed with the usual Tuesday afternoon crowd. Soccer moms grabbing Happy Meals between errands, their SUVs idling in the drive-through lane. Construction workers on their lunch break, their hard hats and fluorescent vests creating splashes of color among the red and yellow decor. Teenagers killing time after school, their phones never leaving their hands. The familiar sounds of sizzling fryers and beeping registers created a steady backdrop of modern American life, a world away from the rice paddies and jungle canopies that still haunted Bobby's dreams 50 years later. "Come on, man," muttered the customer behind him, a middle-aged businessman in a wrinkled suit, checking his phone with obvious irritation. His manicured fingers tapped against his leather briefcase, clean hands that had never held anything more dangerous than a letter opener. "Some of us have places to be. Important meetings." Bobby's hands shook harder as he fumbled with the bills. The tremor had gotten progressively worse over the years, starting as an occasional twitch in his left hand, the same hand that had once steadily held an M16 rifle, and gradually spreading until simple tasks became monumental challenges. Buttoning shirts took 20 minutes. Shaving required focus and patience that left him exhausted. Eating soup was an exercise in humiliation, with more ending up on his shirt than in his mouth. Doctors at the Richmond VA hospital had confirmed what he already suspected after years of research and medical tests. Exposure to Agent Orange during his 2 tours in Vietnam had ravaged his nervous system, along with his liver, lungs, kidneys, and just about every other major organ. The herbicide had been sprayed by the millions of gallons across South Vietnam, meant to strip away jungle cover that concealed enemy positions. What it actually did was poison an entire generation of soldiers who'd served their country without question. Emma Rodriguez, 17 years old and 3 months into her part-time job at McDonald's, watched the scene unfold from behind the register. She'd taken this job to save money for college, dreaming of becoming a nurse like her mother. Her shift usually passed quickly during the afternoon rush, but today something about this particular customer made her pause. She'd seen elderly customers struggle before, arthritis, Parkinson's, various age-related conditions that made simple transactions difficult. But something about this man was different. His clothes were clean but worn, with the careful attention of someone who took pride in his appearance despite limited resources. A faded blue button-down shirt that had been ironed despite fraying cuffs, khaki pants that had been mended multiple times with small, precise stitches, shoes that had been resoled at least twice, polished to a shine that spoke of military discipline that never truly fades. Despite his obvious difficulties with the money, he stood with a kind of quiet dignity that reminded her of someone, though she couldn't immediately place who. The resemblance hit her suddenly. He stood like her grandfather had, even near the end when cancer was eating him alive. That same straight-backed posture that pain couldn't quite break. That same patient endurance of a man who'd learned to bear whatever life threw at him. "Sir, maybe you should step aside and let others order first," suggested the shift manager, approaching with that practiced smile that wasn't really a smile. Marcus was 24, fresh out of business school, and treated every interaction like a case study in efficiency optimization. "You can come back when you're ready. We need to keep the line moving." Bobby nodded slowly. used to this kind of treatment after decades of living with visible disability. He'd been asked to step aside from countless lines over the years, at grocery stores, banks, pharmacies, government offices. The shaking made people uncomfortable, made them assume he was drunk or mentally unstable or simply too old to function in polite society. He never explained about Vietnam, never mentioned Agent Orange or the fact that his trembling hands had once carried wounded soldiers to safety under enemy fire. What was the point? Most people didn't want to hear about ancient wars anyway, especially one that had ended in defeat and controversy. As he started to move aside, fumbling to put his wallet back in his pocket, Emma noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Around his wrist was a thin metal bracelet, partially hidden by his shirt sleeve. When the light caught it just right as he moved, she could make out words engraved on its surface in small, precise lettering. Her breath caught as she read, Agent Orange Survivor, 1st Cavalry Division, Vietnam 1968 to 1970, never forgotten. The world seemed to slow down around Emma as those words hit her like a physical blow. She'd heard those exact words before, countless times during family dinners and holiday gatherings. Her grandfather, James Rodriguez, had served in the 1st Cavalry Division in Vietnam during almost exactly the same period. He died of liver cancer when Emma was 12. Cancer the VA had eventually linked to Agent Orange exposure, though the acknowledgement and benefits had come too late to save him or ease the family's financial struggles during his final illness. Emma remembered sitting by his hospital bed during those last weeks, watching his hands shake as he tried to drink water, listening to him talk about his army buddies and wondering if any of them were still alive. She remembered the Agent Orange survivor bracelet he'd worn, identical to the one on this stranger's wrist. She remembered him telling her that if she ever met another Vietnam veteran, especially one from the 1st Cavalry, she should treat them like family, because they were all brothers who'd shared something that civilians could never understand. Wait, Emma called out, her voice carrying across the restaurant with surprising authority for a 17-year-old. Sir, please don't step aside. I can help you right here. The businessman behind Bobby groaned audibly, making no effort to hide his frustration. Are you kidding me? This is taking forever. I have a conference call in 20 minutes. Emma's eyes flashed with sudden anger that surprised her with its intensity. Then go to another register, she snapped, pointing to her left where another cashier was opening up. This gentleman was here first, and he's going to be served first, with respect. The businessman's face reddened, but something in Emma's tone discouraged further argument. He gathered his belongings and moved to the other line, muttering under his breath about customer service and efficiency. Bobby looked up, surprised by the young woman's intervention. In her eyes, he saw something he hadn't encountered in years. Not pity, not impatience, but recognition. Something deeper that spoke of understanding beyond her years. What can I get for you today, sir? Emma asked gently, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to ease the tension in Bobby's shoulders. And please, take all the time you need. Just a coffee, Bobby managed, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes and the lingering effects of jungle rot that had damaged his throat during his second tour. Black coffee? And maybe, do you still have those apple pies? The fried ones? We absolutely do, Emma smiled, already punching buttons on the register with deliberate slowness to give him time. Would you like it heated up? And would you like me to add some cinnamon sugar on top? It's really good that way. As Bobby nodded gratefully, Emma noticed his hands were still shaking badly as he attempted to count out exact change. Without thinking, she reached under the counter and pulled out a plastic cup with a lid and straw. The coffee might be easier to handle this way, she said quietly, so only he could hear. Less chance of spills. Bobby's eyes widened slightly. In that simple gesture, he saw understanding that went far beyond teenage kindness or company policy. This girl knew something about trembling hands, about the daily struggle to maintain dignity in a world that had little patience for weakness or difference. My grandfather had hands like yours, Emma said softly as she prepared his order, her voice barely audible over the restaurant's ambient noise. From the same thing that's written on your bracelet. Bobby's breath caught. He looked down at the Agent Orange survivor bracelet he'd worn for 15 years, since the VA had finally acknowledged the connection between his service and his deteriorating health. The bracelet had cost him $40 he could barely afford, but it was the only way he had to honor his service and the friends who hadn't made it home. Few people ever noticed it, and fewer still understood what it meant. "First Cavalry?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emma nodded, her eyes already filling with tears. James Rodriguez. He was there from 68 to 69, served 2 tours before rotating home. Died 6 years ago from liver cancer. Her voice caught slightly on the last words, the grief still fresh despite the years. Bobby's legs went weak. He gripped the counter for support as memories flooded back like a dam bursting. Memories of a young, eager soldier named Jimmy Rodriguez who'd been part of his squad during the Tet Offensive. Jimmy, with the infectious laugh and the wallet full of family photos he'd show to anyone who'd listen. Jimmy, who'd shared his last candy bar during a brutal 3-day patrol through hostile territory near the Cambodian border. Jimmy, who'd talked endlessly about the granddaughter back home, who was going to be born any day, who he was going to spoil rotten and teach to ride bikes and help with homework. "Jimmy Rodriguez," Bobby whispered, and Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Jesus Christ, Jimmy Rodriguez, he talked about you. Before you were born, he talked about you all the time." The busy McDonald's around them seemed to fade away as 2 generations connected across the span of decades. Other customers moved to different registers, the normal rhythm of the restaurant continuing. But at Register 3, time had stopped. The smell of French fries and the sound of ice machines became background noise to a conversation that had been 50 years in the making. "He carried your picture," Bobby continued, his voice growing stronger with each word as the memories crystallized. "Even before you were born, he had this ultrasound photo that your grandmother had sent him. Used to show it to everyone in the squad. Tell us all about how he was going to teach you to ride bikes and help you with homework and walk you down the aisle someday. We used to tease him about talking to a baby who wasn't even born yet." Emma was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she heard details about her grandfather that her family had never shared. What happened to him over there? Nobody ever wanted to talk about the war. Mom said it was too painful. Bobby was quiet for a long moment, his own eyes misty with memories he'd tried to bury for decades. "Your grandfather was the bravest man I ever knew. Braver than any of us had a right to be. During the Tet Offensive, when Charlie overran our position near Hugh City, Jimmy stayed behind to help evacuate wounded soldiers. He could have left with the first helicopter, could have saved himself, but he wouldn't leave anyone behind. That was his rule. Nobody gets left behind." He paused, gathering himself as the weight of the story settled on his shoulders. "That's how we all got exposed to the Agent Orange. They were spraying everything, trying to clear the jungle canopy so we could see enemy movement. Rainbow herbicides, they called them. Agent Orange, Agent Blue, Agent White. We breathed it, drank it, lived in it for months. Jimmy knew what it might do to us someday, but he said his granddaughter would understand that some things are worth the risk." Emma wiped her eyes with her sleeve, not caring that other customers were staring or that Marcus, the manager, was hovering nearby with a concerned expression. "He used to tell me I was his greatest mission accomplishment. I never understood what he meant until now. He meant that everything he did over there, every risk he took, every night he spent in those godforsaken jungles, every friend he lost, it was all to make sure you'd grow up in a free country," Bobby explained, his voice thick with emotion. "He used to say that freedom isn't free, and somebody has to pay the price. He was willing to pay it so you wouldn't have to." The shift manager approached cautiously, having noticed the emotional scene, but unsure how to handle a situation not covered in the employee handbook. "Emma, is everything okay here? Do you need me to call someone?" Emma looked up, her face streaked with tears but radiant with something the manager had never seen before. Pride mixed with profound sadness and a deep understanding of sacrifice. "This man served with my grandfather in Vietnam. My grandfather saved his life, and he's been carrying the memory of our family for 50 years. Actually, Bobby thought to himself, it was the other way around. Jimmy had died pulling Bobby to safety when mortar rounds started falling on their position during a night ambush. But that was a story for another time, when the pain wasn't so fresh. The manager's expression changed completely, his business school efficiency replaced by genuine human feeling. "Sir, your order is absolutely on the house today, and sir, thank you for your service. Thank you for what you and your friends did for all of us." Bobby nodded gratefully, but his attention remained focused on Emma. "Your grandfather made me promise something before the end. He made me promise that if I ever made it home alive, I'd find his family and tell them he loved them and that he was proud to serve. But when I got back, everything was so chaotic and I was so messed up from the war." His voice trailed off as he remembered those dark early years back home. "You were dealing with your own trauma," Emma said gently, with wisdom beyond her 17 years. "Grandpa would understand. He always said the war followed soldiers home." "I looked for your family for years," Bobby continued, his voice gaining strength. "But Jimmy had talked about moving to Texas after the war to work in the oil fields, and I was searching in all the wrong places. The VA wasn't much help. Records were scattered, privacy laws made it hard to track down families. I never imagined I'd find his granddaughter working at a McDonald's in Virginia. 50 years later." Emma smiled through her tears, remembering her grandfather's favorite saying. He always said God works in mysterious ways, and that there are no coincidences in life, only meetings that were meant to happen. As Bobby's order came up, coffee in a cup with a lid and a perfectly heated apple pie, Emma personally carried it to a quiet booth in the corner of the restaurant, helping him sit down and making sure his coffee was positioned where he could reach it easily with his trembling hands. Other customers watched with a mixture of curiosity and growing respect as word of the story spread through whispered conversations and shared glances. "Can I ask you something personal?" Emma said, sliding into the seat across from him. "How do you live with it? The shaking, the memories, all of the pain?" Bobby considered the question carefully, stirring his coffee with slow, deliberate movements. "Some days are harder than others. The VA helps when they can, but the bureaucracy is its own kind of war sometimes. Mostly, I just try to remember why we were there in the first place. Men like your grandfather didn't die for nothing. They died so kids like you could grow up free, could work part-time jobs and go to school and dream about the future without fear." "Do you have family of your own?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the sadness in his eyes. Bobby shook his head slowly. "Wife left while I was still on my second tour. Came home to divorce papers and an empty house. Kids. Well, the Agent Orange took care of that possibility. Doctor said it affected my ability to have children. A lot of us came back broken in ways that didn't show up until years later." He said it matter-of-factly, but Emma could see the pain behind his words. The weight of a life lived largely in solitude, watching other people build families while he carried the ghosts of Vietnam alone. "Then your family now," Emma declared with the absolute certainty that only teenagers possess. "Grandpa always said his war buddies were his brothers. Closer than blood, because they'd shared life and death together. That makes you my uncle." For the first time in years, Bobby smiled. Really smiled. The kind of smile that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. "Uncle Bobby, I like the sound of that, Emma. I like it a lot." Emma pulled out her phone, fingers flying over the screen. "I want you to meet my mom and my abuela, my grandmother. They need to hear your stories about Grandpa, and you need to see his photos, his medals, the letters he sent home from Vietnam. Mom kept everything. I don't want to intrude on your family." "You're not intruding," Emma interrupted firmly. "You're coming home, finally." As the afternoon wore on, their conversation deepened. Bobby shared stories about Vietnam that brought both tears and laughter. Jimmy's terrible jokes that somehow seemed funny in the middle of a war zone, his ability to find hope in the darkest situations, his unwavering belief that they were fighting for something important despite the growing opposition to the war back home. Emma told him about her grandfather's final years, how he'd struggled with nightmares and survivor's guilt, how he'd worked multiple jobs to support the family despite his deteriorating health, how he'd never complained about the pain but had whispered Jimmy's name and the names of other fallen soldiers during his final moments in the hospital. Other customers began approaching their table as word spread about the Vietnam veteran and the McDonald's employee connected by history and sacrifice. An elderly man with a Navy cap introduced himself as a sailor who'd served off the Vietnamese coast during the same period. A young woman with a military bearing thanked Bobby for his service and quietly paid for his next meal. A group of teenagers from the local high school asked respectful questions about Vietnam, genuinely interested in learning about a war they'd only read about in history textbooks. For Bobby, the attention was overwhelming. He'd spent decades feeling invisible, forgotten by a country that had moved on from an unpopular war. The tremor in his hands hadn't improved. The Agent Orange was still slowly killing him. But for the first time in 50 years, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Emma's shift was supposed to end at 6, but she stayed late, sitting with Bobby and sharing stories that bridged the gap between generations. She told him about her plans to study nursing, inspired partly by her grandfather's tales of military medics who risked everything to save wounded soldiers. Bobby shared memories of Jimmy that painted a picture of a young man who'd faced death with courage and humor. "There's something else," Bobby said as the evening wound down and the restaurant began to empty. "Something I've carried with me for 50 years, waiting for this moment." He reached into his wallet with trembling fingers and pulled out a small, faded photograph. The ultrasound image that Jimmy had shown everyone in the squad, carried through jungles and firefights and sleepless nights on guard duty. "He wanted you to have this," Bobby said, placing the photo gently in Emma's hands. "He said someday, when you were old enough to understand, you'd know that you were loved before you were even born by a grandfather who saw your future in a grainy black and white picture." Emma stared at the ultrasound image, her first photograph, taken before she existed in any meaningful way, carried through hell by a grandfather who dreamed of meeting her. The photo was creased and faded, but she could still make out the tiny form that would become her. "I have something for you too," she said, reaching behind her neck to unclasp a small necklace she wore. It was Jimmy's dog tags, passed down through the family as a sacred reminder of his service. "He'd want you to have these. You were his brother." Bobby's hands shook even more as he accepted the tags, reading the familiar information that brought back a flood of memories. James A. Rodriguez, Catholic, B positive, 1949. He'd seen these tags every day for 2 years in Vietnam, had held them when Jimmy died, had helped zip them into the body bag with his best friend. As they prepared to leave, Emma made Bobby promise to come back the next day. And the day after that. She gave him her phone number and her mother's number, programmed her contact information into his old flip phone, and insisted he call if he needed anything. Groceries, rides to medical appointments, just someone to talk to. "This isn't goodbye," she said firmly as they stood in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights. "This is hello, finally." Bobby drove home that night to his small apartment across town, the dog tags hanging from his rearview mirror, the ultrasound photo carefully placed on his dashboard. For the first time in decades, he didn't feel alone. The tremor was still there, the pain was still constant, but something fundamental had changed. He had family again. The next morning, Emma arrived at work to find a small crowd gathered around Register 3. Word had spread on social media about the Vietnam veteran and the McDonald's employee connected by her grandfather's sacrifice. Local news crews were setting up cameras in the parking lot, and the restaurant manager was fielding calls from reporters wanting to interview them both. But Emma's attention was focused on the familiar figure sitting in the corner booth, coffee in hand, waiting for her, with the patient endurance of a man who'd spent a lifetime waiting for this moment. He was wearing a clean shirt and had shaved carefully, his silver hair combed with military precision. "Uncle Bobby," she called out as she clocked in, and his face lit up with that same genuine smile that had transformed him the day before. As she began her shift, Emma realized that what had started as an ordinary Tuesday at McDonald's had become something much more profound. In a world that often seemed divided and angry, she'd witnessed the power of recognition, of honoring sacrifice, of understanding that the trembling hands of an elderly veteran carried the weight of history and the promise of freedom. The story would eventually be shared thousands of times on social media, inspiring similar acts of recognition across the country. But for Emma and Bobby, it wasn't about going viral or making news. It was about family. The family you're born into and the family you choose, connected across generations by love, sacrifice, and the simple recognition that everyone has a story worth hearing. Bobby's tremor would never go away. The Agent Orange would continue its slow, relentless work, but he would never again feel invisible or forgotten. And Emma would carry forward her grandfather's legacy, understanding finally what he'd meant when he said, "Freedom isn't free," and that some debts can only be repaid through recognition and remembrance.